Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Night shifts at Sunset Manor became my life after I got my CNA certification. 24 years old and desperate for healthcare experience before nursing school, I grabbed the first opening they had. The retirement home sat tucked between almond orchards outside Sacramento, where the California wind would whistle through the trees during those long midnight hours. 53 residents called the place home, and most nights passed quietly, checking vitals, helping with bathroom trips, adjusting pillows for restless sleepers. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood lived in room 237, right at the end of the East Wing hallway. She had this habit of staying up late, reading romance novels with a tiny booklight, and she'd always wave when I passed by during my 2 a.m. rounds. Natural causes took her on a Tuesday night in September 2017. Peaceful in her sleep, just like everyone hoped they'd go. Her family cleared out her belongings within the week, leaving behind only the institutional furniture and that faint smell of lavender hand cream she always used. Mrs. Blackwood had been everyone's favorite resident. Immigrated from Scotland in the 1950s with stories that could keep you entertained for hours, she spoke with this musical accent that made even complaints about the cafeteria food sound charming. Her emergency call button sat right next to her bed, a red device connected to the main nursing station that would beep and display her room number whenever pressed. She rarely used it, maybe once every few weeks for genuine needs, never the type to abuse the system like some residents did. The woman was fiercely independent, proud of still being able to dress herself and walk to the dining room without assistance. When she passed, maintenance disconnected her call button according to protocol, same as they did for every vacant room. The electrical system at Sunset Manor was old but reliable, installed sometime in the 1980s when the building first opened. Each call button connected directly to hardwired circuits running through the walls, no wireless signals or batteries to malfunction. Simple technology that worked exactly as designed. 2 weeks after Mrs. Blackwood's funeral, the call button from room 237 started going off again. First time happened during my Thursday night shift, right at 3:42 a.m., according to the digital clock at the nursing station. The familiar beep echoed through the quiet hallway, followed by the automated voice announcing, "Room 237 requesting assistance." I stared at the illuminated panel, knowing damn well that room stood completely empty. Maintenance had supposedly disconnected everything, yet there it was, clear as day. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the East Wing, my sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum floors. The hallway felt colder than usual, probably just the old heating system acting up again. Room 237's door stood slightly ajar, which seemed odd since housekeeping always kept vacant rooms securely closed. I pushed it open and swept my flashlight across the bare mattress, empty dresser, and that disconnected call button hanging uselessly by the bed. Everything appeared normal, sterile, waiting for the next occupant. The next night, same exact thing. 3:42 a.m. The room 237's call button activated again. This time I marched straight to the maintenance office and left a note for Tony, our daytime repair guy, explaining the malfunction. Had to be some kind of electrical short or crossed wires, maybe moisture getting into the old system. These things happened in buildings this age, especially during California's rainy season when humidity levels fluctuated. Tony was thorough, been working at Sunset Manor for over a decade, knew every pipe and wire in the place. When I came in the following evening, he'd left me a response note. Checked room 237 completely. Call button physically disconnected at junction box. No power running to device. System showing no faults, must be mistake. His handwriting was neat, precise, like everything else about his work. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen on that display panel. The automated voice didn't lie, and those lights didn't illuminate themselves. Saturday night rolled around and I decided to position myself strategically. Instead of sitting at the nursing station, I grabbed a chair and planted myself halfway down the East Wing hallway, directly facing room 237. The clock on my phone showed 3:35 a.m. when I settled in, determined to catch whatever was causing this electrical anomaly. Maybe Tony missed something. Maybe there was interference from another system. Had to be a logical explanation. The building settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, that old wood expanding and contracting as temperatures shifted. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across the institutional carpeting. Mrs. Chen in 235 was snoring softly, and Mr. Patterson in 239 had his television playing quietly. Some late-night movie with dramatic music that barely penetrated his closed door. Everything felt normal, routine, exactly like every other night shift I'd worked. Then 3:42 a.m. arrived, and the call button alarm pierced the silence just like clockwork. The display panel lit up at the nursing station behind me, but this time I was watching room 237 directly. The door remained closed, exactly as I'd left it during my earlier rounds. No movement, no lights, no indication that anything had been disturbed. Yet the automated voice echoed through the hallway. Room 237 requesting assistance. The sound seemed to bounce off the walls, lingering longer than usual in the quiet space. I approached the door slowly, every nerve on high alert, my flashlight beam steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The metal handle felt cold under my palm as I turned it, pushing the door open to reveal the same empty room I'd seen every night before. Bare mattress, disconnected call button, nothing out of place. But as I stepped back into the hallway, ready to dismiss this as another unexplained glitch, something caught my attention. The faintest sound of footsteps moving away from me, heading toward the locked exit door at the end of the wing. My heart started pounding as I turned my flashlight toward the sound. The beam swept across empty hallway, illuminating nothing but institutional beige walls, and that heavy exit door marked "Emergency use only, alarm will sound." The footsteps had definitely been real, not my imagination playing tricks after too many consecutive night shifts. Soft-soled shoes against linoleum, the kind nurses wore, deliberate and unhurried. But the hallway stretched before me completely vacant, no possible hiding spots between where I stood and that exit door. I checked every room along the way, all locked tight, residents sleeping peacefully behind closed doors. The exit door itself required a key card and would trigger the building's security system if opened without authorization. I tested the handle anyway, finding it securely locked, no signs of tampering. The metal was cold to the touch, and when I pressed my ear against it, I heard nothing from the other side except the distant hum of the building's mechanical systems. For the next week, I started documenting everything meticulously. Each night at exactly 3:42 a.m., room 237's call button would activate despite being physically disconnected from the electrical system. I wrote down the exact time, weather conditions which residents were awake, any unusual sounds or circumstances. The pattern never varied, always the same time, always the same automated announcement, always followed by those mysterious footsteps if I positioned myself to listen carefully. Other staff members started thinking I was losing it when I brought up the situation during shift changes. "Old buildings do weird things," Janet from day shift would say with a dismissive wave. Probably just settling noises and electrical interference. But Janet hadn't heard what I heard, hadn't seen that call panel light up night after night for a room that supposedly had no working electronics. The maintenance log showed Tony had checked the system 3 more times, even bringing in an electrician from outside the facility. Every test came back negative. No power reaching room 237, no faults in the wiring, no explanation for the phantom calls. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night when I decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of rushing to room 237 immediately after the call button activated, I hung back at the nursing station and watched through the security monitor. Sunset Manor had basic cameras installed in the main hallways, black and white feeds that recorded to an old VHS system in the office. The East Wing camera had a clear view of room 237's door and the surrounding area. At 3:40 a.m., I positioned myself in front of the monitor, finger ready to hit the record button on the VCR. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, my eyes glued to that grainy screen showing the empty hallway. Then 3:42 a.m. arrived, the call button alarm sounded, and I watched the monitor intently. For several seconds, nothing appeared different on the screen, just the same static view of institutional carpet and closed doors. But then as I squinted at the display, I caught movement. A shadow seemed to detach itself from room 237's doorway, moving with purpose toward the exit door at the end of the hall. The shadow moved like a person, but the camera couldn't pick up any clear details in the poor lighting. It glided rather than walked, maintaining a consistent pace that suggested familiarity with the hallway layout. I watched it reach the exit door and then simply vanish, as if it had stepped through solid metal and concrete. My finger trembled as I stopped the recording, rewound the tape and played it back immediately. The same sequence repeated. Empty hallway, call button activation, shadow movement, disappearance at the exit door. This wasn't electrical interference or building settlement, or my imagination running wild from too much caffeine. Someone or something was triggering that call button every night, then making their way to the locked exit without actually opening it. The timestamp on the recording showed 3:42 a.m. exactly, matching my handwritten logs perfectly. I ejected the tape and slipped it into my bag, evidence that finally proved I wasn't losing my mind. But it also meant that whatever was happening at Sunset Manor defied every logical explanation I could think of. The following night, I made a decision that probably wasn't the smartest thing I'd ever done. Armed with my video evidence and a determination to end this mystery once and for all, I positioned myself directly outside room 237 at 3:40 a.m. If this shadow figure was going to emerge from Mrs. Blackwood's old room, I wanted to see it up close and personal. The hallway felt different that night, charged with an energy I couldn't quite describe. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. I stood with my back against the wall opposite the door, flashlight ready, every muscle tense with anticipation. The digital clock on my phone showed 3:41, then 3:42, and right on schedule the call button alarm echoed through the building. But this time, instead of rushing to investigate, I stayed perfectly still and watched. The door to room 237 remained closed, but I heard the distinct sound of the handle turning from the inside. Slowly, impossibly, the door began to open. What emerged from that room will stay burned into my memory forever. The figure of an elderly woman in a faded nightgown, moving with the careful shuffle I remembered so well. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood stepped into the hallway, looking exactly as she had in life except for her eyes, clouded over and unfocused, staring straight ahead without seeing. She moved past me as if I wasn't there, her slippered feet making no sound against the linoleum floor. I wanted to call out, to run, to do something, but my voice caught in my throat, and my legs refused to move. She walked with purpose toward the exit door, the same route I'd seen that shadow take on the security footage. When she reached the end of the hallway, she simply kept walking, passing through the solid metal door like it was made of mist. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Then I walked back to the nursing station, sat down at my desk and wrote out my resignation letter. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some night shifts are too long for any amount of money to be worth it. There was this stretch in 2019 when I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner just outside of Des Moines. I had just moved back to Iowa after a rough breakup in Chicago and needed something, anything, to keep the bills paid while I figured things out. The job was simple and mindless, which was kind of what I needed at the time. Most nights were dead quiet, just a couple of long-haul truckers and the same 3 old guys who came in for coffee and eggs like clockwork around 3 a.m. I didn't love it, but it felt safe in its own boring way. The diner sat right off the highway with flickering neon signs and a parking lot that always looked like it belonged in a crime scene photo. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. My shift was midnight to 8 a.m., and I was usually alone until the morning cook came in around 6. That night started like any other. I was wiping down the counter, half watching some old infomercial on mute, when I noticed the occupied light on the customer restroom had been on for way too long. It had been at least 20 minutes. No one had come out. I knocked lightly, then called out. No response. Figuring maybe someone had gotten sick or passed out, I grabbed the key and opened the door. It hit me before I even turned on the light. This thick metallic smell that instantly made me nauseous. The moment I flipped the switch, my heart started hammering. There were bloody handprints smeared across the mirror and down the edge of the sink. One was on the paper towel dispenser, another streaked down the side of the stall. No one was inside. No blood in the toilet, nothing on the floor, just those prints, like someone had pressed their hands down slowly and deliberately. I backed out and locked the door again. My first instinct was to check the cameras, but the monitor was mounted in a weird spot behind the counter, and the angles didn't show the bathroom door directly, only the hallway leading to it. I rewound the footage maybe 30 minutes back. Between 12 and 12:45, no one had gone down that hallway. Not a soul. The last customer had left at 12:03, a guy in a red hoodie who got a slice of pie to go. After that, nothing. No movement. I was trying to figure out if I was losing it when the front door chimed. He walked in kind of stiff, like his legs didn't quite know what to do. Mid-30s maybe, wearing a tan windbreaker zipped up all the way despite how warm it was inside. His eyes darted around the diner like he was expecting someone to jump out from under a booth. I asked if he wanted coffee, and he just stared at me for a second before shaking his head and saying, "Have you seen my friend? He said he was going to meet me here." I asked what his friend looked like. The guy blinked a few times, then scratched the side of his head like he'd just been asked a question he didn't understand. "Tall," he said. "Brown hair. He was right behind me." I glanced toward the cameras again, my stomach churning. Not from fear exactly, but that strange kind of discomfort you get when the world suddenly stops making sense. I just watched the feed. No one had come in with him, not even close. I tried to play it cool, told him I hadn't seen anyone else tonight, and asked if he wanted to sit while he waited. He nodded slowly and took a booth near the window, sitting with his back ramrod straight, both hands flat on the table like he was trying to steady himself. He didn't order anything. Didn't move. I waited a few minutes before checking the footage again, just to be sure. Rewound the last few minutes, played it back frame by frame. The man had walked in completely alone. The automatic doors opened once, for him. There was no one behind him, no one lagging a few steps back, not even a shadow. I double-checked every camera angle I had. If someone else had come in, they would have had to phase through the damn walls. Still, he sat there like he was expecting someone to slide into the booth any second. When I brought him a glass of water, mostly to break the silence, he looked up at me and said, real soft, "He said the bathroom. Maybe he's in the bathroom." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stood there holding the glass, thinking about those blood-slicked handprints and how nobody had been seen going in. I asked if his friend had been injured or anything. He blinked again, this slow, dazed blink, then whispered, "He told me not to come in." But I came in. That's when I realized his hands were shaking under the table. I stepped back behind the counter, partly because I didn't know what else to do, partly because I needed a barrier between us. Something about the way he sat there, frozen in that exact posture, made my scalp itch. I picked up the phone and called the non-emergency line for the local sheriff's office. I didn't even know what I was reporting, just that a guy came in asking for a friend who didn't exist, and that there was blood in the bathroom no one had entered. The dispatcher said they'd send someone over. I didn't mention the cameras. I didn't mention the smell. I just wanted someone else there. The guy didn't move the entire 20 minutes it took for a deputy to arrive. He didn't even flinch when the bell over the door rang again. Deputy Carson walked in, looked at me, then over at the man in the booth. I nodded toward the hallway, and Carson went to check the bathroom first. Less than a minute later, he came back out and asked me quietly if I'd cleaned anything. I told him no, that's exactly how I found it. His face didn't change much, but he radioed for backup and an ambulance, just in case. That's when the man stood up. No warning, no sound. He walked calmly toward the bathroom, as if he had just remembered something important. Carson told him to stop, but the man didn't even acknowledge him. I watched as he reached the door, turned the knob slowly, and walked inside. Carson followed a few seconds later. I couldn't see anything from where I was, but a few minutes passed before Carson stepped out again, alone. He looked paler than when he came in. He walked over and asked me if I was sure I'd seen that man come in. I told him yes. He looked back at the hallway and said, "There's no one in there." They let me go home after that. Took my statement, copied the security footage, asked a million questions I didn't have real answers to. Nobody ever came forward looking for that man, or a missing friend, or anything connected. The footage they pulled? It showed me unlocking the bathroom, staring at the mirror, and backing out. The blood was visible, but the man, according to the copy they gave the sheriff's office, he never came in. Just a flicker of static around the time I remembered him walking through the door. I haven't worked another night shift since. Eight months into my graveyard shift at the Metro Transit Authority, I thought I'd seen everything the underground had to offer. Rats the size of small cats, homeless people who'd found creative ways to bypass security, and the occasional drunk who wandered onto the tracks thinking they could walk home through the tunnels. At 26, the job wasn't glamorous, but it paid my rent in Brooklyn and gave me time to think about finishing my engineering degree. The 4th Avenue station had become my second home. Every bolt, every electrical panel, every shadowy corner was familiar territory. Most nights were routine. Check the systems, clean what needed cleaning, and make sure nobody was where they shouldn't be. The motion sensors, emergency exits, and security cameras all had their quirks that I'd learned to work around. What happened that November night, though, wasn't just another quirk of the system. Wednesday started normally enough. I clocked in at 11:45 p.m., grabbed my gear and descended to the platform level where the real work happened. The tunnels were actually comfortable that time of year, not the sweltering heat of summer or the bitter cold that somehow found its way down from the streets in winter. My routine never varied much. Southbound platform first, then the electrical systems, then a sweep of the 3 tunnel entrances that connected to different lines. Around 2:30 a.m., I was wrapping up the electrical panel inspection when something caught my attention on the monitoring station. The motion sensors for Tunnel C were lighting up sporadically, showing movement near the entrance. When I pulled up the security feed on the monitor, the image kept flickering and cutting to static every few seconds. Could have been another rat, or maybe a piece of debris blowing around, but company policy was clear. Any unusual sensor activity required a visual inspection. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward Tunnel C, which was the deepest of the 3 entrances, and led to the express line that ran underneath the local tracks. The tunnel mouth was about 50 yards from the main platform, accessible through a maintenance corridor that most passengers never saw. As I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoed in that particular way underground spaces have, hollow and slightly delayed, like the sound was bouncing off invisible walls. The air got noticeably cooler as I approached the tunnel entrance, and I could hear the distant rumble of a train passing through one of the other lines. The motion sensor was mounted about 10 feet inside the tunnel entrance, positioned to catch anyone who might wander in from either direction. When I reached the threshold and shined my flashlight into the darkness, I expected to see the usual suspects, maybe a plastic bag caught on the rail, or one of those oversized rats that seem to rule the deeper tunnels. Instead, I saw her. A woman in a dark coat was standing about 20 feet into the tunnel right next to the express tracks. She wasn't moving, just standing there with her back to me, unnaturally still in a way that made my chest tighten. The express trains ran every 12 minutes even during the night shift, and she was close enough to the tracks that the wind from a passing train could easily knock her over. I called out to her immediately, "Hey, you can't be in there!" But she didn't respond or even turn around. Her dark hair hung straight down her back and her coat looked expensive, not like the typical clothing of someone who'd ended up in the tunnels by accident. The way she stood was wrong somehow, too perfect and motionless, like a mannequin someone had placed there as a sick joke. I needed to get her out of there fast, but protocol required me to radio it in first before approaching anyone in the tunnel system. I keyed my radio with trembling fingers and called dispatch. "Control, this is Maintenance Unit 7 at 4th Avenue. I've got a civilian in Tunnel C about 20 feet in, standing next to the express tracks. Need immediate assistance and possible train delays on the express line." The response came back within seconds. Dispatch confirmed they were contacting transit police and asked me to keep visual contact but not approach until backup arrived. I kept my flashlight trained on her while I waited, and that's when I noticed more disturbing details. Her coat wasn't just dark, it was perfectly black, so black it seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. And she was wearing heels, actual dress heels, which made no sense for someone who'd somehow made it deep into a subway tunnel. The sound of the next express train was getting louder, that familiar rumble that started as a whisper and built to a roar. I had maybe 3 minutes before it would come screaming through this section. "Ma'am, there's a train coming. You need to move away from the tracks right now," I shouted, abandoning protocol and stepping into the tunnel entrance. The rumble was getting stronger, and I could see the faint glow of the train's headlight beginning to appear around the far curve. She still hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted her weight or turned her head. It was like she was rooted to that spot, completely oblivious to the danger bearing down on her. I started moving toward her, my work boots echoing loudly on the concrete and metal, but as I got closer, something in my gut told me to stop. The air around her seemed different, colder and somehow thicker, like walking into a freezer. When I was about 10 feet away, I could see that her coat wasn't just touching the ground, it was pooling around her feet in a way that defied gravity. The train's headlight was now clearly visible and the sound was becoming deafening. That's when she turned around. I wish I could forget what I saw, but her face is burned into my memory forever. It wasn't a face at all. It was smooth, featureless skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Just blank, pale flesh stretched over bone, with dark hair framing nothing. No expression because there was nothing to express with. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking wildly, and in that moment of pure terror, I understood that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. The express train was maybe 30 seconds away now, its horn blaring as it approached the station, but it just stood there, that blank face turned toward me. I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to get out of that tunnel, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like concrete and my throat had closed up completely. The thing tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me, and then the strangest thing happened. It raised one pale hand and waved at me, a slow, deliberate gesture that somehow felt mocking. The express train hit the tunnel entrance with a sound like thunder, its headlight flooding the space with harsh white light. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed myself against the tunnel wall, expecting to hear the horrible impact, the screech of brakes, something. But there was only the normal sound of the train passing through, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, the whoosh of displaced air, the gradual fading as it continued toward the next station. When I opened my eyes and pointed my flashlight back toward where she had been standing, the tunnel was empty, completely empty. No woman, no dark coat, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. I stayed pressed against that wall for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The motion sensors had gone silent, showing no activity in the tunnel. Whatever I had seen was gone, like it had never existed in the first place. When I finally managed to move, I stumbled back to the monitoring station and immediately pulled up the sensor logs on the computer. The records showed the exact timeline. Motion detected at 2:31 a.m., consistent activity until 2:47 a.m., then nothing. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. According to the entry and exit sensors positioned at both ends of Tunnel C, no one had entered or left that tunnel in over 6 hours. The system tracks every person, every large object, anything bigger than a rat that moves through those checkpoints. The logs were clean, showing only my own entry at 2:35 a.m. when I went to investigate. I ran the diagnostics 3 times, checked every sensor, even called the night supervisor to verify the system was working properly. Everything checked out perfectly. According to the Metro Transit Authority's own security system, I had been alone in that tunnel the entire time. But I know what I saw, and I know it waved at me with that pale, lifeless hand. Transit police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers who'd clearly been roused from a quiet night shift and weren't thrilled about checking out a possible trespasser call. Officer Williams was a veteran who'd worked the subway beat for 15 years, and Officer Martinez was newer, but had that no-nonsense attitude that comes from dealing with the city's underground craziness every night. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but even as the words came out of my mouth, they sounded insane. A faceless woman in an expensive coat, standing in a restricted tunnel, who disappeared when the train passed through. They listened politely, took notes, and did a thorough sweep of all 3 tunnels with their high-powered flashlights. They found nothing, of course. No footprints, no trace evidence, no sign that anyone unauthorized had been in the system. Williams suggested I might have seen shadows cast by the approaching train's headlight, maybe combined with some debris that got caught in the air current. Martinez was more direct. He asked if I'd been drinking or taking any medication that might affect my perception. I finished my shift in a daze, going through the motions of my remaining checks but constantly glancing toward Tunnel C. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every sound made me jump. When my replacement arrived at 8 a.m., I practically ran out of there. But I couldn't just let it go. Over the next few days, I started researching the history of the 4th Avenue station during my off hours. What I found made everything worse. The station had been built in 1976 over the site of an older terminal that had been demolished after a fatal accident in 1968. A woman named Victoria Ashford had fallen onto the tracks during rush hour and was killed instantly by an incoming train. The newspaper archives described her as wearing a dark winter coat and having long black hair. They never determined if she had jumped, been pushed, or simply lost her footing. The really disturbing part was that several witnesses mentioned how she'd been standing unusually close to the platform edge, perfectly still, for several minutes before she fell. Reading those accounts gave me chills because it matched exactly what I had seen. That unnatural stillness, the positioning near the tracks. I quit my job 2 weeks later. I told my supervisor it was to focus on finishing my degree, which wasn't entirely a lie, but the real reason was that I couldn't handle working in those tunnels anymore. Every night shift became an exercise in terror, wondering if I'd see her again, wondering if next time she might do more than just wave. I never saw the faceless woman again, but other maintenance workers started reporting strange motion sensor readings in Tunnel C over the following months. The equipment was replaced twice, but the intermittent signals continued. Management eventually just learned to ignore them, chalking it up to some kind of electromagnetic interference from the older infrastructure. I know better, though. Victoria Ashford is still down there, still standing by those tracks, still waiting for something or someone. I sometimes wonder if the faceless thing I saw was her way of showing me what death had taken from her. Not just her life, but her very identity, her ability to be recognized as human. I never went back to check, and I never will. Posted this on RR Glitch in the Matrix, but figured it belonged here too. Still gives me chills thinking about it, and it happened almost 6 months ago. At the time, I was pulling overnight security shifts at Riverside General Hospital in Ohio. One of those old brick buildings from the 1970s with endless hallways and that sterile smell that never really goes away. The pay wasn't great, but the job was straightforward enough. Walk the rounds, check doors, monitor the parking areas, and make sure everything stayed quiet during those dead hours between midnight and sunrise. Most of the hospital emptied out after visiting hours, leaving just the essential staff on the medical floors, and me wandering around with my flashlight and radio. The radio system they used was pretty standard. Nothing fancy, just basic two-way communication between security, maintenance, and the night supervisors. Each of us had our own unit with a specific call number, and dispatch would log every transmission that came through the main desk. During my shifts, radio chatter was usually minimal. Maybe a maintenance guy calling about a busted light bulb, or one of the nurses requesting an escort to the parking garage. The frequencies were supposed to be secure and limited to hospital personnel only, though occasionally we'd pick up some random trucker or construction crew bleeding through on a similar channel. Never thought much of it until that particular Thursday night in March when everything started going sideways. It was around 1:15 a.m. when I first heard it. This faint, crackling voice coming through my radio while I was doing my rounds on the third floor. At first I thought it was just static or maybe someone accidentally keying their mic, but then I heard it clearly. A child's voice, maybe 7 or 8 years old, saying, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The voice was so quiet and tinny through the speaker that I almost dismissed it as interference from some kid playing with a toy walkie-talkie nearby. But we were in the middle of a hospital at night, and the pediatric wing had been closed for renovations for the past month. There weren't supposed to be any children in the building at all, let alone awake and playing with radios at past 1 in the morning. I stopped walking and held the radio closer to my ear, waiting to see if I'd hear it again. The hallway around me was completely silent except for the distant hum of the HVAC system and that occasional beeping from the medical equipment in the rooms. Then, about 30 seconds later, the voice came back. "I can't find my mom. Can you help me find my mom?" The transmission was clearer this time, and I could tell it was definitely a young boy speaking. His voice had that particular quality that kids get when they're scared or confused, shaky but trying to be brave. I keyed my radio and responded, asking who was speaking and what their location was, but got nothing back except static. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 minutes before the frequency went quiet again. I immediately called dispatch to report what I'd heard, thinking maybe there was a lost child somewhere in the building that security hadn't been notified about. The night supervisor, Linda, checked all the patient logs and confirmed what I already suspected. No pediatric admissions, no children visiting after hours, and definitely no kids who should have access to hospital radio equipment. She suggested it might be interference from outside the building, maybe some neighborhood kid with a scanner, or cheap walkie-talkie picking up our frequency. That explanation made sense, and I probably would have forgotten about the whole thing if it hadn't happened again the next night at almost exactly the same time. This time, the boy's voice was asking about his teddy bear, wondering if anyone had seen a brown bear with a red ribbon around its neck. The third night was when things really started getting under my skin. Same time frame, right around 1:20 a.m., but this time the transmission lasted longer. The kid was talking about being cold and wanting to go home, and there was something in his voice that made my chest feel tight. He sounded genuinely distressed, not like a child playing pretend or messing around with radio equipment. I started walking faster through my rounds, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot where a kid might be. The hospital felt different that night, bigger somehow, with shadows that seemed deeper than usual. Every creak of the building settling, every distant sound from the medical floors made me pause and listen. When I got back to the security office, I decided to check the radio logs myself instead of just reporting it to dispatch. The radio log system was pretty basic, just a computer terminal that recorded every transmission with a timestamp, duration, and the call number of the unit that sent it. I pulled up the data from the past 3 nights and scrolled through looking for anything around the 1 to 2 a.m. time frame. What I found made absolutely no sense. The transmissions were being logged as coming from Unit 47 Delta, which, according to our equipment roster, was a radio that had been reported stolen from a maintenance closet 2 years ago. I double-checked the records 3 times to make sure I was reading it right. Unit 47 Delta had been written off as a loss in January 2021, and there was even a police report number associated with the theft. Yet here it was, showing up in our logs, transmitting clear audio from what sounded like a terrified child. I spent the rest of that shift digging through old incident reports and maintenance logs, trying to figure out if there was any logical explanation for what was happening. The original theft report mentioned that the radio had gone missing during a busy period when contractors were working on the heating system. Security footage from that time had already been deleted per the hospital's retention policy, so there was no way to see exactly how or when it disappeared. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. Unit 47 Delta had been assigned to the pediatric wing before it was stolen, the same wing that was now closed for renovations. I kept thinking about that boy's voice, how real and frightened he sounded, and wondering how a stolen radio could still be transmitting on our secure frequency after 2 years of being missing. The 4th night, I was ready for it. I positioned myself near the old pediatric wing around 1 a.m. Radio turned up to full volume, waiting to see if I could pinpoint where the signal might be coming from. The renovated area was completely dark and sealed off with plastic sheeting and construction barriers, but I had master keys to get inside if needed. At 1:18 a.m., the voice came through again, clearer than ever. "My name is Tommy. I'm 6 years old and I can't find the way out." My heart started pounding as I realized this was the first time the kid had given his name. I tried responding immediately, asking Tommy where he was and telling him I was coming to help. But just like before, he didn't seem to hear me. The transmission continued for almost 5 minutes this time, with Tommy describing a room with broken toys and peeling wallpaper, saying he was scared of the dark and wanted his parents. Something about his description nagged at me, so I decided to check the closed pediatric wing myself. I pulled back the plastic sheeting and stepped into what used to be the children's play area. The renovations had stripped most of the walls down to the studs, leaving exposed pipes and electrical work. But in one corner I found something that made my skin crawl. There was an old toy box that hadn't been removed yet, filled with stuffed animals and broken games that matched exactly what Tommy had been describing. The wallpaper he mentioned was still partially visible on one wall, faded cartoon characters that were peeling away in long strips. I stood there with my flashlight, looking at this abandoned playroom, when Tommy's voice came through the radio again. "The security man is here, I can see his light." I spun around, sweeping my flashlight across the empty room, but there was nobody there. That's when I really started to panic. Tommy could somehow see me, but I couldn't see him. I called out loudly, asking where he was, telling him to come toward my voice, but the only response came through the radio. "I think I'm stuck. I've been here a really long time." I searched every inch of that playroom, moved boxes, checked behind equipment, even looked up in the ceiling tiles but found nothing. The whole time Tommy kept talking through the radio, describing exactly what I was doing. When I moved the toy box, when I checked behind the old hospital bed, when I stood in the doorway looking confused. It was like he was watching me from somewhere I couldn't reach. The worst part was how his voice started getting fainter with each transmission, like the battery in his radio was dying, and he began repeating that he was cold and wanted to go home. I ran back to the security office and called my supervisor, then the hospital administrator, then anyone I could think of who might have answers. By the time the day shift arrived, I had a dozen people crowded around the radio logs, all staring at the impossible evidence that Unit 47 Delta was actively transmitting. That morning, the hospital brought in a tech specialist who traced the signal and found something incredible. The missing radio was buried in the foundation of the new parking garage that had been built 2 years ago, right where the old pediatric wing's east wall used to be. When they excavated it, they found Unit 47 Delta still functional, somehow powered by a damaged electrical line, along with some personal items that belonged to a child named Tommy Mitchell, who had been a patient in 2021. The transmissions stopped completely after they recovered the radio, and I never heard Tommy's voice again. Nobody could explain how the whole thing worked, but I transferred to day shift the next week because those night rounds just weren't the same anymore. Quick stop off Route 70 in Kansas became my second home after I picked up the graveyard shift to help pay for nursing school. At 24, the job seemed simple enough. Ring up gas, restock the energy drinks, and try not to fall asleep during the dead hours between 2 and 6 a.m. The store sat like a lonely beacon on a stretch of highway, where wheat fields stretched endlessly in every direction, and most nights I'd see maybe a dozen customers total. Truckers would stop for coffee and bathroom breaks. College kids from the nearby university would grab late-night snacks, and the occasional insomniac would wander in for cigarettes or energy drinks. After 6 months of the same routine, I thought I'd seen every type of person who traveled that desolate stretch of road. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly overhead, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that made even the healthiest person look like they were dying. And the smell of stale coffee mixed with cleaning chemicals had become as familiar as my own perfume. During those quiet hours, time moved differently. Minutes felt like hours, and I'd find myself counting the bugs that gathered around the exterior lights or memorizing the expiration dates on the candy bars just to keep my mind occupied. The cash register was ancient, one of those loud machines that sounded like a slot machine every time it opened, and the security cameras were positioned in the corners with their red blinking lights that supposedly made people think twice about shoplifting. Most nights, the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerators, the occasional car passing by without stopping, and the country music station that played the same 12 songs on repeat. I'd gotten comfortable with the solitude, even started bringing textbooks to study during the slow periods. My manager, a guy named Pete who'd been running gas stations since before I was born, always said the night shift was perfect for students because nothing ever happens after midnight in Kansas. He was wrong about that, but I wouldn't find out just how wrong until that Tuesday in February, when everything changed. It was 3:17 a.m. when I first noticed him, and I only remember the exact time because the digital clock above the register had been stuck on 3:16 for what felt like an eternity, then suddenly clicked over, just as headlights swept across the parking lot. A dark blue sedan pulled up to pump number 3, and through the windows, I could see it was an older model, maybe from the early 2000s, with a dent in the passenger side door and a bumper sticker I couldn't quite make out. The man who got out was average height, wearing a brown leather jacket that looked like it had seen better decades, and jeans that were faded in that way that comes from years of wear rather than fashion. What struck me immediately was how deliberate his movements were, not rushed like most people at that hour, but careful, almost rehearsed. He pumped exactly $12 worth of gas, no more, no less, watching the numbers on the display with an intensity that seemed excessive for such a mundane task. When he finished, he walked toward the store with the same measured pace, and I noticed he kept his head down, never once looking directly at the security cameras. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and he moved through the aisles with purpose, like he knew exactly where everything was despite this being his first time in the store that I'd seen. He grabbed a small bag of salted peanuts from aisle 2, a bottle of water from the refrigerated section, and a pack of spearmint gum from the display near the counter. The total came to $4.67, and he paid with exact change. Not credit, not a $5 bill that would require change, but exact coins down to the penny. When I tried to make small talk, asking how his night was going, he just nodded slightly and made a sound that might have been fine, but was so quiet I couldn't be sure. His eyes never met mine directly, but I could feel him watching me as I rang up his items, studying my movements the same way he'd studied the gas pump. There was something about his presence that made the store feel smaller, like the walls had moved in a few inches while he was there. After I handed him his receipt, he stood there for maybe 10 seconds longer than necessary, not saying anything, just existing in that space between the counter and the door before finally turning and leaving without a word. The next night, Wednesday, I'd almost forgotten about him until 3:17 a.m. rolled around again. Same headlights, same blue sedan, same pump number 3. I watched through the window as he went through the identical routine. $12 of gas, same careful attention to the display, same deliberate walk to the store. When he came inside, he traced the exact same path through the aisles, picked up the same items in the same order. Peanuts, water, gum. Same total, same exact change. Same barely audible response when I tried to engage him in conversation. The only difference was that this time, when he stood at the counter after getting his receipt, he lifted his eyes just enough that I caught a glimpse of them. Pale blue, almost gray, with an intensity that made me want to step back. There was no malice in them, but there was something else, something calculating, like he was memorizing details for a test he'd have to take later. I found myself checking the clock obsessively after he left, noting that he'd been in the store for exactly 7 minutes, just like the night before. The precision of it all was starting to unnerve me, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he worked a factory job with a rigid schedule. Maybe he had obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Thursday night came and went with the same routine, down to the minute. Friday night, the same. By Saturday, I was positioned at the window at 3:15, watching the empty highway and feeling ridiculous for anticipating a customer like he was some kind of appointment. But there he was again, punctual as a train schedule, going through his ritual with the dedication of someone performing a religious ceremony. The familiarity of it was somehow worse than if he'd changed something. At least variation would have felt human. Instead, each night felt like watching the same movie on repeat, and I started to notice details I'd missed before. The way he always parked with his car angled slightly toward the exit, engine running the entire time. How he never bought anything that required refrigeration or had a short shelf life. The fact that his leather jacket never seemed to get dirty despite how worn it looked. Most unsettling was how he seemed to know exactly where I'd be standing behind the counter, positioning himself so that he could see me without appearing to look directly at me. By Sunday night, the routine had become so predictable that I started timing him, and sure enough, 7 minutes from door to door, never varying by more than a few seconds. Monday morning, when Pete arrived to open the day shift, I was waiting for him in the parking lot. I'd been wrestling with whether to say anything all weekend, second-guessing myself and wondering if I was overreacting to what might just be an eccentric customer with particular habits. But the consistency of it all had gotten under my skin in a way I couldn't shake. Pete was a straightforward guy in his 50s who'd seen everything in 20 years of gas station management, and if anyone would know whether this was normal behavior, it would be him. I described the man, the timing, the identical purchases, and Pete listened with the kind of attention he usually reserved for reports about missing inventory or broken equipment. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, chewing on the toothpick he always had between his teeth. Then he told me about the security system, how it recorded everything but only kept footage for 2 weeks before recording over itself. He pulled up the recordings from the past week on his office computer, and we watched together as the same scene played out night after night. The blue sedan, the man in the leather jacket, the precise routine. Seeing it on screen somehow made it more real and more disturbing, like we were watching surveillance footage of a crime that hadn't happened yet. Pete agreed that the behavior was unusual enough to warrant attention, and he promised to mention it to the day shift staff to see if anyone recognized the man or the car. He also gave me his personal cell phone number and told me to call immediately if anything escalated beyond the routine visits. That night, Tuesday, I felt better knowing that someone else was aware of the situation and that I had backup if needed. I positioned myself at the counter with Pete's number already pulled up on my phone, ready to hit call if necessary. 3:15 came and went with no sign of the blue sedan. 3:17 passed, then 3:20, then 3:30. For the first time in a week, The highway remained empty during what had become his time, and instead of relief, I felt a strange kind of anxiety, like waiting for a shoe to drop that never came. The absence was almost worse than the presence had been, because now I didn't know what to expect. Had my conversation with Pete somehow scared him away? Had he noticed me watching him more carefully? Or was this just the natural end to whatever compulsion had been driving him to make these nightly visits? I spent the rest of my shift glancing at the clock and checking the windows, but he never showed up. Wednesday night started the same way. Empty highway, quiet store, and me trying to convince myself that whatever had been happening was over. Around 2:45 a.m., I was restocking the cigarette display behind the counter when I heard a car pull into the lot. My heart rate spiked immediately, and I turned toward the windows expecting to see the familiar blue sedan. Instead, a red pickup truck was parked at pump number 2, and a woman in scrubs was filling up her tank, probably a nurse heading home from a late shift like I'd be doing in a few hours. She came in, bought coffee and a breakfast sandwich for later, chatted briefly about how dead the hospital had been that night, and left. Normal customer, normal interaction, exactly the kind of encounter that used to make up my entire shift. But as I watched her taillights disappear down the highway, I realized I was still on edge, still expecting the blue sedan to materialize at any moment. The clock seemed to move slower as it approached 3:17, and when that time came and went with no sign of him, I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt like I was being watched, not from inside the store, but from somewhere outside, beyond the reach of the exterior lights where the darkness was complete and impenetrable. At 3:25 a.m., a car pulled into the lot and parked in the exact same spot where the blue sedan always parked, pump number 3, angled toward the exit. But this was a different car, a gray compact that looked newer than the sedan, and the person inside didn't get out to pump gas. They just sat there, engine running, headlights off. From where I stood behind the counter, I could see the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, but the darkness and the angle made it impossible to make out any details. What I could see clearly was that they were wearing the same brown leather jacket, not similar, but identical, down to the worn patches on the sleeves and the way it hung on their shoulders. The car sat there for exactly 7 minutes, the same amount of time the man usually spent inside the store. And during that entire time, I felt like I was being studied through the windows. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the hum of the refrigerators, and I found myself backing away from the windows, trying to stay in the blind spots where the person in the car couldn't see me. When the 7 minutes were up, the car pulled away slowly, deliberately, without the driver ever getting out or acknowledging my presence in any obvious way. The moment the gray car disappeared from view, I called Pete. It was nearly 3:35 a.m., and I knew I was waking him up, but the situation had crossed a line from strange to genuinely frightening. Pete answered on the 4th ring, groggy but alert when I explained what had just happened. He told me to lock the doors immediately, and only open them for customers who actually needed to come inside, and he'd be there within 20 minutes. While I waited, I reviewed the security camera footage from my phone app, rewinding to capture the gray car's arrival and departure. The video quality wasn't great in the darkness, but it clearly showed the 7-minute timeline and confirmed that the person inside had been wearing the same distinctive leather jacket. When Pete arrived, he brought coffee and a serious expression, and we spent the remainder of my shift going through the footage together and discussing what this could mean. The working theory was that either the original man had switched cars to avoid detection, or someone else was deliberately copying his routine. Both possibilities were disturbing in their own way. Pete decided to file a report with the local sheriff's department and recommended that I request a transfer to day shift for my own safety. I never worked another night shift at that quick stop. Pete called me 2 days later to tell me that the sheriff's deputy had reviewed all the security footage and filed it as a suspicious activity report, but without any actual crime being committed, there wasn't much they could do besides increase patrols in the area. The day shift manager, a woman named Betty, mentioned that she'd asked around town about a man in a brown leather jacket driving a blue sedan, but nobody recognized the description. What bothered me most was never finding out who it was or why the routine had been so important to them. 6 months later, when I finally finished nursing school and moved to Denver for a hospital job, I drove past that quick stop one last time during daylight hours. It struck me how small and vulnerable it looked in the middle of all those empty fields, like a target that had been carefully selected rather than randomly chosen. I never found out if the visits continued after I left, but sometimes during my night shifts at the hospital, when the halls are quiet and I'm walking past darkened windows, I think about that brown leather jacket and wonder if someone else is out there, performing their own careful routine, and whether the person they're watching knows they're being watched. The precision of it all still gives me chills, because whatever was happening during those 7 nights wasn't random. It was planned, deliberate, and probably not over, just relocated. You'd be surprised how quiet a funeral home can get after nightfall. Not peaceful quiet, more like the kind that builds pressure in your ears, like the building itself is holding its breath. Back then, I was working part-time at Weaver & Sons, the only funeral home in a small Kentucky town called Halverton. I was 26, still figuring things out, and the job had kind of fallen into my lap through a friend of my uncle's. Most nights were uneventful. Tidy up, log the visitor book, check the chapel lights, and make sure nobody left a program or tissue box behind. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to keep the lights on in my apartment above the bakery downtown. That night had been a service for a local man named Harold Finch, someone I barely knew except that he used to own the hardware store and had a fondness for model trains. The turnout had been decent. Lots of old-timers, a few grandkids, the usual hushed condolences and Kleenex exchanges. Everything wrapped up around 8:30 p.m., and by 9:15 I was doing my rounds, making sure the front doors were locked and the last of the coffee urns were scrubbed out. The viewing room, what we called the main chapel, was dimly lit, with just the aisle sconces and one overhead fixture above the casket still on. It's protocol to leave some light in there overnight. Creepy, but standard. I was halfway through loading the dishwasher in the staff kitchenette when I heard it. 3 knocks, sharp and spaced evenly, like someone rapping knuckles against a heavy wooden door. I paused, thinking maybe it was just the sound of the building settling. But it came again, same rhythm, same pressure behind it. It wasn't coming from the front entrance or the office. It was coming from the chapel, where Mr. Finch's body still lay. I hesitated for a second, hand still on a mug, and then walked over to the small desk in the hallway where the security monitor sat. We only had 3 cameras, front door, back hallway, and a wide angle fixed on the chapel from the far end. The chapel feed was on a slight delay, but clear enough. I watched it as I stood there, arms folded, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. The viewing room was empty. Rows of chairs, Mr. Finch's casket at the front, and the faint glow from the lights. I let it play for another 10 seconds and then, clear as day, a figure moved into frame. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a dark coat. They didn't walk in. They walked out, straight through the middle aisle, past the rows of empty chairs, and out of view toward the side door that should have been locked since before sunset. But what made my jaw tighten wasn't just the fact that no one else had come in. It was that the side door never opened. Not once. I stood there for a solid minute, just staring at the screen like it would give me an explanation if I waited long enough. The playback didn't glitch. The lighting didn't flicker. There was no shadow play or trick of the eye. Someone, or something, had walked out of that room. I backed up the footage and watched it 3 more times. Same result. No entry, just an exit. I tried convincing myself it could have been a reflection, maybe a staff coat hanging on a chair catching a weird light angle. But deep down I knew that figure had movement, real movement. Weight, presence. It moved like it had intention. I decided to check the viewing room in person, half out of habit, half out of some irrational hope that seeing it in real life would make it less weird. I walked slowly down the main hallway, past the flower arrangements that still smelled too sweet in the quiet. The air felt heavier near the chapel doors. Not cold, not warm, just thick. When I pushed the door open, everything looked exactly as it should. Casket closed, chairs empty, aisle clean. But there was something off about the silence now. It wasn't just quiet, it was aware, like the room was waiting for something. I stepped inside and followed the path down the middle, my sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. When I reached the casket, I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe I expected to see the lid cracked or the flowers moved. But no, everything was intact, except for one thing. One of the chairs in the third row was angled just slightly out of line with the others, like someone had been sitting there and got up in a hurry. I hadn't noticed it before, and we always realign everything at the end of a service. It bothered me in a way I couldn't explain, like seeing a photograph that's been tilted just a few degrees on the wall. Not wrong enough to fix immediately, but just enough to gnaw at the back of your mind. I didn't touch the chair. I just backed out slowly and headed to the side exit door the figure had supposedly gone through. It was locked. Deadbolt still turned. I even tugged at it twice to be sure. Then I walked around the building, stepped outside into the gravel lot, and checked the exterior handle. Also locked. No footprints, no signs of someone having slipped through. And there were motion lights on that side. Nothing had triggered them. I stood there in the dark with my breath hanging in front of me, trying to come up with some explanation that didn't involve words like ghost or entity or anything that would make me sound like I'd lost it. Back inside, I rewound the footage again, slower this time. The figure wasn't blurry, but the details stayed just out of reach, like it was being filmed through a pane of dirty glass. No face, no features I could make out. Just height, shape, movement. I froze the frame where it was halfway down the aisle and stared at it, searching for anything. An ID badge, a reflection, even a weird glitch that could explain it. But it was solid, like it belonged there. That was the part that messed with me the most. It didn't move like an intruder. It moved like someone finishing something, like they were done and ready to leave. The rest of the night dragged. I locked every door again, shut off the remaining lights, and left the chapel last. On the way out, I grabbed the little logbook we kept on the front desk, the one where guests signed their names. I flipped through the last page and scanned the entries from earlier. Most were family or locals I recognized, but one stood out. Slanted handwriting, black ink, just a first name, Royce. No last name, no message. I didn't remember anyone by that name during the service. I called Jenna, the other assistant who'd been on shift earlier, and asked if she'd seen anyone unfamiliar that night. She paused, then said, "There was a tall guy in the back who didn't really talk to anyone. Thought he was a cousin or something." The next morning, I asked Mr. Weaver, the owner, about Royce. He flipped through the registry and shrugged. Nobody by that name in the family. Maybe someone from the old neighborhood. I mentioned the security footage. He didn't even want to see it. Just gave me this tired look, like this wasn't the first time someone had come to him with something strange. "This place has been here since 1954, he said. "Things linger. Don't let it follow you home." That last line sat with me for weeks. I started keeping a small cross in my glove box, left the hallway lights on in my apartment more than I used to. Eventually, I stopped working nights altogether. Switched to day shifts, then left the job 6 months later when something else opened up at the county clerk's office. Never told anyone else about it. Not because I was afraid they'd call me crazy, but because part of me felt like I wasn't supposed to. Like saying too much would pull whatever that thing was back into my life. I don't know who Royce was, or what he was doing in that room alone after everyone had gone. But every time I passed by the old funeral home, I glanced toward the side door, half expecting to see someone tall and still, waiting just inside the glass. So I work nights as a janitor at this massive corporate building in downtown Portland. Been doing this gig for about 3 years now, And honestly, it's pretty decent work. The pay isn't amazing, but I get health benefits, and most importantly, I work alone. No office politics, no small talk, just me, my cleaning supplies, and 42 floors of empty cubicles and conference rooms. The building houses like 6 different companies, so it's always buzzing during the day. But after 7 p.m., it becomes this weird ghost town. I usually start my shift around 9 p.m. and finish up by 6 a.m. Perfect for a guy like me who's never been much of a people person. My routine is pretty set in stone. I clock in at the security desk in the lobby, grab my cart from the supply closet on the 2nd floor, and work my way up methodically. The building management is strict about the time clock system because they track everything for billing the different companies. It was a Tuesday night in April 2023, and I was running a bit late because my car wouldn't start. Had to take 2 buses to get there, which meant I didn't clock in until almost 9:30. The security guard, this older guy named Frank, was reading his newspaper and barely looked up when I badged in. He's been working there longer than anyone, and pretty much knows every face that comes and goes. As I walked over to the time clock terminal near the elevators, I noticed it was acting up again. The screen was flickering and making this weird buzzing sound. These old machines are constantly breaking down, but management refuses to upgrade them. I swiped my badge and waited for the confirmation beep, but instead, the screen displayed this long list of recent entries. Usually, you only see your own entry when you clock in, but this thing was showing everyone's punches from the past few days. That's when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Right there, between my entry and the day shift supervisors, was a clock-in time for someone named Kevin Walsh. Now, Kevin Walsh was this maintenance guy who used to work here, but he got fired back in August of last year. I remember because it was this whole dramatic thing that had the entire building talking for weeks. Kevin had been acting really strange for months before they finally let him go, showing up at weird hours, talking to himself in the hallways, and getting into arguments with people who weren't even there. The final straw was when someone found him sleeping in one of the conference rooms on the 28th floor at like 3 a.m. Security had to escort him out, and Frank told me later that Kevin had been ranting about how the building needed him and how he wasn't finished with his work here yet. The guy seemed completely unhinged by the end, so seeing his name pop up on the time clock 8 months after he'd been banned from the premises was definitely not normal. I figured it had to be some kind of system glitch, maybe old data getting mixed up with current entries. These machines are ancient and prone to all sorts of technical issues, but as I stared at that entry, I noticed the timestamp was from just 2 hours earlier, 7:47 p.m. That meant someone had used Kevin's credentials tonight, which was impossible since all fired employees get their access revoked immediately. I took a photo of the screen with my phone, thinking I should probably report this to Frank, or maybe building management in the morning. The whole thing was giving me an uneasy feeling, but I tried to push it aside and focus on getting my work done. I had a lot of ground to cover, and being late had already thrown off my usual schedule. I grabbed my cleaning cart and headed for the elevators, but as I passed the security desk, I noticed Frank had stepped away, probably doing his hourly rounds. The lobby felt eerily quiet tonight, more so than usual. Even the street outside seemed unusually empty for a Tuesday evening. The fluorescent lights were humming louder than normal, and there was this faint smell in the air that I couldn't quite place. Something musty and stale, like old clothes that had been sitting in a damp basement for too long. I started my rounds on the 3rd floor, working through the marketing firm's offices. Everything seemed normal at first. Empty desks, turned-off computers, the usual mess of coffee cups and food wrappers that people leave behind. But as I was emptying the trash cans near the break room, something caught my eye on the small table where employees usually eat their lunch. There, sitting right in the middle of the table like someone had deliberately placed it there, was an ID badge. I picked it up and immediately felt my stomach lurch. It was Kevin Walsh's employee badge, complete with his photo and the company logo. The plastic was worn and slightly yellowed, like it had been carried around in someone's pocket for months. But what really freaked me out was that the badge looked recently used, There were fresh fingerprint smudges on it, and the lanyard still had that new, clean appearance. I turned the badge over in my hands, trying to make sense of how it could have gotten here. Security was supposed to collect all badges when someone got fired, and this building had strict protocols about access control. The rational part of my brain was telling me that maybe Kevin had hidden the badge somewhere before getting fired, and a cleaning crew had just found it and left it on the table. But that didn't explain the time clock entry from earlier tonight. I pulled out my phone and called Frank's extension, but it went straight to voicemail. He was probably still doing his rounds on one of the upper floors. I decided to hold on to the badge and report both incidents when I saw him later. As I continued cleaning the break room, I kept glancing at that badge sitting on my cart. Kevin's photo stared back at me. He had this intense, almost angry expression, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. I remembered seeing him around the building during his final weeks, always muttering under his breath and carrying this beat-up toolbox that he never seemed to put down. The guy had always been a bit odd, but toward the end, he was genuinely unsettling. Other employees started avoiding him, and I heard rumors that he'd been writing strange messages on bathroom walls and leaving weird notes in people's desks. I finished up the 3rd floor and moved on to the 4th, trying to shake off the creepy feeling that was settling over me. The building felt different tonight, like there was this underlying tension in the air that I couldn't explain. As I worked my way through the accounting firm's offices, I kept hearing these faint sounds: soft footsteps, doors closing, the occasional creak of floorboards. Old buildings make noise, especially at night when the temperature drops and everything starts contracting. But these sounds seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic. I found myself pausing every few minutes to listen, but whenever I stopped moving, the sounds would stop too. It was like someone was matching my pace, staying just far enough away to avoid being seen. By the time I reached the 7th floor, I was genuinely on edge. This floor housed a small law firm that only occupied half the space, leaving the eastern wing completely empty and supposedly locked off. But as I passed the security door that separated the two areas, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The door was slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two, and there was a faint light coming from somewhere beyond it. I approached the door carefully and peered through the gap. The empty wing should have been pitch black, but I could see this dim, yellowish glow coming from what looked like the far end of the hallway. It wasn't the harsh white light of the building's fluorescent fixtures, but something softer and warmer, like a desk lamp or maybe even candlelight. I tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which was definitely not supposed to happen. Building policy required all unused areas to be secured at all times, and only senior management had keys to these sections. I pulled out my phone to call Frank again, but realized I was getting no signal up here. Cell reception in this building was always spotty, especially on the higher floors where all the steel and concrete interfered with the towers. I stood there for a long moment trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just close the door and pretend I never saw anything, but I knew I'd have to report it eventually. If someone was squatting in the building or if there was some kind of security breach, it was my responsibility to investigate. I pushed the door open wider and stepped into the darkened hallway, immediately noticing that musty smell again, but stronger now. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lined with empty offices that hadn't been used in over a year. Most of the doors were closed, but a few stood open, revealing dark spaces filled with nothing but dust and old carpet stains. I moved slowly toward the source of the light, my footsteps echoing off the bare walls. The building's ventilation system seemed louder here, creating this constant low hum that was almost hypnotic. As I got closer to the end of the hall, I could see that the light was coming from a corner office, the one with the big windows that overlooked the street. I stopped just outside the doorway and listened. There was definitely someone in there. I could hear the faint sound of papers rustling, and what sounded like someone mumbling or talking quietly to themselves. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was inside could hear it. I took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway, and what I saw made me want to turn around and run. The office had been turned into some kind of makeshift living space. There was a sleeping bag spread out on the floor, surrounded by empty food containers, water bottles, and stacks of papers covered in handwritten notes. But what really disturbed me was the person sitting at the old desk in the corner, hunched over what looked like building blueprints or floor plans. Even though I could only see his back, I recognized the greasy hair and the worn flannel shirt immediately. It was Kevin Walsh, and he was very much alive and apparently living in this abandoned office. He hadn't noticed me yet. He was too focused on whatever he was writing, muttering under his breath in a way that reminded me of those final weeks before he got fired. The desk was covered with dozens of sheets of paper, all filled with his cramped handwriting, and there were photos taped to the wall above the desk. I couldn't make out what they were from my position, but they looked like surveillance photos of people entering and leaving the building. There was also that beat-up toolbox I remembered, sitting open on the floor beside him, filled with what looked like electronic equipment and wires. The whole scene was surreal. Here was this guy who'd been banned from the building 8 months ago, living like some kind of hermit in an empty office, apparently conducting his own investigation or surveillance operation. I realized I needed to get out of there immediately and call the police, but as I started to back away, one of the floorboards creaked under my weight. Kevin's head snapped up instantly, and he spun around in the chair to face me. The look in his eyes was wild and unfocused, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. His face was gaunt and covered with patchy facial hair, and his clothes looked like he'd been wearing them for days. For a moment, neither of us moved or said anything. Then he smiled, this unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "Oh good, you found me. I was wondering when someone would finally notice." His voice was hoarse and raspy, completely different from how I remembered it. He gestured toward the papers on his desk and continued, "I've been documenting everything, you know. All the irregularities, all the security gaps, all the ways this building is vulnerable. They thought they could just get rid of me, but I know this place better than anyone." I managed to stammer out something about him not being supposed to be here, but he just laughed and shook his head. "Supposed to be here? I never left. I've been watching, learning, improving the systems. Someone has to protect this place." The way he said it made it clear he genuinely believed he was doing something important and necessary. I knew I had to get out of there fast, so I told him I needed to go check on something and would be right back. Kevin just nodded enthusiastically and said he'd wait for me, that he had so much more to show me. I backed out of the office as calmly as I could, and then practically ran down the hallway to the security door. Once I was back in the main part of the building, I immediately called 911 from the stairwell, where I finally got a signal. The police arrived within 15 minutes, along with building security and a couple of paramedics. When they went up to the 7th floor, they found Kevin exactly where I'd left him, still sitting at that desk, completely cooperative and almost relieved to see them. Turns out he'd been living in various empty offices throughout the building for months, moving around to avoid detection, and somehow bypassing the security systems using knowledge he'd gained from his time as a maintenance worker. The police said he was clearly having some kind of mental health crisis and needed professional help, rather than jail time. They found journals full of paranoid writings about the building being under threat, and his belief that he was the only one who could protect it. After that night, building management completely overhauled their security protocols, and I never saw Kevin again. But sometimes when I'm working alone on those upper floors, I still think about how he'd been up there all those months, watching and waiting, convinced he was the building's guardian angel.